The morning sun cast long shadows across the village square as Alara stood with her hands bound behind her back. Her father's gambling debts had finally caught up with their family. The debt collectors had come at dawn, dragging her from her bed like a common criminal. "Please," her mother begged, tears streaming down her weathered face. "She's just a child. Take me instead." But the men laughed coldly. "She's 18. Old enough, and worth far more than you, old woman." Liara held her head high, even as fear clawed at her stomach. She had heard the stories about what happened to girls sold to pay debts. They disappeared into the darkness of faraway lands, never to be seen again. The crowd gathered as the auction began. Local farmers bid on livestock. Merchants haggled over grain. And then came the slaves. "Here we have a fine young woman," the auctioneer called out, grabbing Ilara's chin and forcing her to look up. "Strong for work, pretty for other purposes." The crowd snickered. Ilara's cheeks burned with shame, but she refused to cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. 10 silver, called out a fat merchant. 15, shouted a tavern keeper with yellowed teeth. The bidding continued, each number feeling like another chain around Ilara's neck. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself somewhere else. Anywhere else. Then a voice cut through the crowd like a blade through silk. 20 silver. The square fell silent. Everyone turned to see who had made such a bold bid. He sat on a black horse at the edge of the crowd, tall and imposing. Dark hair fell to his shoulders, and a scar ran from his left temple to his jaw. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, cold and merciless. This was Magnus the Ruthless, warlord of the Northern Territories. The man who had never lost a battle, the man who showed no mercy to his enemies. 20 silver going once. The auctioneer's voice trembled. No one dared bid against the warlord. Everyone knew what happened to those who opposed Magnus. Going twice. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. Of all the men who could have bought her, why did it have to be him? She had heard the stories. Magnus collected beautiful women like other men collected weapons. None of them lasted long. Sold to Magnus of the Northern Territories, the warlord dismounted his horse and walked through the crowd. People scattered like mice before a cat. He stopped in front of Ilara and studied her face with those cold grey eyes. "Look at me," he commanded. Ilara raised her chin and met his gaze. She expected to see cruelty there, perhaps lust. Instead, she saw something she hadn't expected. Surprise. For a moment, Magnus just stared at her. Something flickered across his face, gone too quickly to identify. Then his expression hardened again. He threw a leather pouch at the auctioneer's feet. The coins clinked together with finality. "Untie her," Magnus ordered. The auctioneer's hands shook as he cut Ilara's bonds. Her wrists were raw and bleeding, but she didn't flinch. Magnus studied her for another long moment. Then he turned to his horse and mounted it in one fluid motion. "Walk behind the horse," he told her. "Try to run, and I'll drag you the rest of the way." And so began Ilara's journey into the unknown, following the black horse of the most feared man in the kingdom. The ride to Magnus's stronghold took 3 days. Ilara's feet were bloody and blistered by the time they reached the massive stone castle that loomed against the grey sky like a sleeping giant. The gates opened with a grinding sound that seemed to echo in Ilara's bones. Inside, the courtyard bustled with activity. Soldiers trained with swords and spears, servants hurried about their duties, and everywhere the smell of leather, steel and sweat. Magnus dismounted and threw his reins to a stable boy. "Take her to the East Tower," he told a servant woman. "Give her food and clean clothes. She looks half dead." The servant woman, elderly with kind eyes, led Elara through corridors lined with weapons and battle banners. The castle was magnificent but cold, like its master. "What's your name, child?" the woman asked as they climbed a spiral staircase. "Elara. I'm Martha. I've served this house for 30 years. She paused at a heavy wooden door. "A word of advice, dear. The master seems harsh, but he's fair. Don't give him reason to punish you, and you'll be treated well." The room behind the door was small but comfortable. A bed with clean linens, a wash basin, and a window that looked out over the surrounding mountains. "Rest tonight," Martha said. "Tomorrow the master will decide what work you'll do." After Martha left, Elara sat on the bed and finally allowed herself to cry, not for her lost freedom, but for her family. What would happen to her parents now? Would her father's creditors be satisfied, or would they demand more? She must have fallen asleep, because the next thing she knew, sunlight was streaming through the window. A tray of bread, cheese and milk sat on the small table. Her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since before the auction. As she ate, Elara planned her escape. The castle was large, but she was young and quick. If she could make it to the gates during the chaos of the evening meal. Planning something foolish, Elara spun around to find Magnus standing in the doorway. How had he entered so silently? "I don't know what you mean," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Magnus stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. In the small space, he seemed even larger and more intimidating. "I've seen that look before," he said. "It's the same look rabbits get when they're about to bolt from a trap." "I'm not a rabbit." "No," Magnus agreed, studying her face. "You're not." He moved to the window and looked out at the mountains. For a moment, something like sadness crossed his features. "Do you know what they call me?" he asked. "Magnus the Ruthless. Do you know why?" Elara shook her head. "Because I've never shown mercy to an enemy. Because I take what I want and destroy what stands in my way." He turned to face her. "Because I've killed more men than I can count." Fear crawled up Elara's spine, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "Then why haven't you killed me?" The question seemed to surprise him. For a long moment, he just stared at her. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. Over the following days, Elara discovered that life in Magnus's castle was not what she had expected. Instead of being thrown into the dungeons or forced into his bed, she was given work in the castle's great library. "You can read?" Magnus had asked when Martha mentioned Elara's education. "Yes, my lord, my mother taught me." "Then you'll help organize my books. Many were damaged in the last siege." The library was vast, filled with scrolls and books from across the known world. Elara had never seen so much knowledge in one place. As she worked, she found herself getting lost in tales of distant lands and ancient heroes. Magnus would sometimes visit the library, usually late at night when the castle had grown quiet. He never spoke to her directly, but Elara could feel his eyes on her as she worked. One evening, she found him standing before a shelf of poetry books, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Is there something specific you're looking for, my lord?" she asked carefully. "There was a book," he said without looking at her, "about a knight who fell in love with a peasant girl. I can't remember the title." Elara thought for a moment, then reached for a slim volume bound in blue leather. "The Tale of Sir Gareth and Lady Mira?" Magnus's eyes widened slightly. "That's it. How did you—" "It's a beautiful story," Elara said softly, "about how love can transform even the hardest heart." Something flickered in Magnus's eyes. Pain, perhaps, or longing. "Love is a luxury I cannot afford," he said harshly. "Why?" The question slipped out before Elara could stop it. Magnus went very still. For a moment, Elara thought he might strike her for her impertinence. Instead, he took the book from her hands, his fingers brushing against hers. "Because love makes you weak," he said quietly. "And weak men don't survive in this world." After he left, Elara stood in the empty library, her heart racing. There had been something in his touch, something in his voice, that spoke of deep wounds and buried pain. As weeks passed, Elara began to see glimpses of the man behind the fearsome reputation. Magnus was indeed ruthless in business and war, but she noticed other things too. He never raised his voice to the servants. He made sure the castle's people were well fed, even when supplies ran low. And sometimes, late at night, she could hear him walking the battlements alone, as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. One night, a terrible storm struck the castle. Thunder shook the stones, and lightning illuminated the sky like day. Elara was trying to sleep when she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. Someone was screaming. She crept from her room and followed the sound to the Lord's chambers. The screaming had stopped, but she could hear heavy breathing and muttered words through the thick door. "No, please, not the village. Spare the children." Magnus was having a nightmare. Elara knew she should return to her room. She had no business here, but something about the raw pain in his voice made her hesitate. The door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, she could see Magnus thrashing in his sleep, sweat glistening on his bare chest. His face was twisted in anguish. "Stop," he gasped. "I won't. I can't." Without thinking, Elara pushed open the door and hurried to his bedside. "My lord," she whispered, gently touching his shoulder. "You're dreaming. Wake up." Magnus's eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused. His hand shot out, grabbing Elara's wrist in a grip that would leave bruises. For a moment, he didn't seem to recognize her. Then awareness returned to his eyes, followed quickly by shock. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, releasing her wrist. "You were having a nightmare," Elara said gently. "You were in pain." Magnus sat up, running his hands through his dark hair. "You shouldn't be here. If anyone saw you, there's no one about. The storm. You don't understand." Magnus cut her off. "If my men thought if they believed I was soft." "Showing pain doesn't make you soft," Elara said quietly. "It makes you human." Magnus looked at her, then really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "You should go," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Instead of leaving, Elara sat on the edge of the bed. "What did you dream about?" For a long time, Magnus didn't answer. Thunder rumbled overhead, and rain lashed against the windows. Finally, he spoke. "My first battle. I was 16, barely old enough to hold a sword properly. My father sent me to raid a village that had refused to pay tribute." Elara waited, sensing there was more. The villagers fought back. They were just farmers and shopkeepers, but they defended their homes fiercely. Magnus's voice was barely above a whisper. When the battle was over, the village was in flames. Women and children lay dead in the streets. "That wasn't your fault," Elara said softly. "Wasn't it?" Magnus looked at her with haunted eyes. "I led the charge. I gave the orders. I became the monster they needed me to be. But you'll regret it. That's what makes you different." Magnus laughed bitterly. "Regret doesn't bring back the dead." "No, but it can prevent more deaths. It can guide you to be better." For a moment, they sat in silence. Then Magnus reached out and gently touched the bruises on Elara's wrist, where he had grabbed her. "I hurt you," he said. "It's nothing. It's not nothing. I swore I would never." He trailed off, his jaw clenching. "Never what?" Magnus met her eyes. "Never hurt someone innocent. Never become like my father." The vulnerability in his voice broke something open in Elara's chest. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his scarred cheek. "You're not him," she whispered. Magnus's breath caught. His hand came up to cover hers, pressing it against his face. "Alara," he said her name like a prayer. And in that moment, everything changed. The next morning, Magnus avoided the library entirely. When their paths crossed in the corridors, he barely acknowledged her presence, but Alara could feel the weight of his gaze when he thought she wasn't looking. She tried to tell herself it was for the best. She was his property, nothing more. Any feelings between them were dangerous for both of them. But late at night, when the castle grew quiet, she found herself thinking about the way he had said her name, the way his hand had trembled when he touched her face. A week after the storm, Martha approached her in the library. "The master has requested your presence in his private study," the older woman said. Alara's heart began to pound. "Did he say why?" "No, child, but you'd best not keep him waiting." Magnus's private study was smaller than the library, lined with maps and battle plans. When Alara entered, he was standing before the fire, his back to the door. "You asked me to come, my lord. Close the door." Alara did as he commanded, her pulse quickening. Magnus turned to face her, and she was struck by how tired he looked. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and tension pulled at the corners of his mouth. "I've been thinking about what happened the other night," he said. "My lord, if I overstepped—" "You didn't." He moved closer, and Alara caught the scent of leather and pine that always seemed to cling to him. "That's the problem." "I don't understand." Magnus stopped just arm's length away. "For 20 years I've lived by one rule. Never show weakness. Never let anyone get close enough to hurt me." His grey eyes searched her face. "But you saw me at my weakest, and you didn't run. You didn't try to use it against me. You showed me kindness." "You deserve kindness," Alara said softly. "Do I?" "After everything I've done, everyone deserves a chance at redemption." Magnus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You still don't understand what I am, what I've done. Then tell me." "I've burned villages. I've taken lands that weren't mine. I've killed men who were only trying to protect their families." His voice grew harsher with each confession. "I am everything you should fear and despise." Alara stepped closer. "And yet you bought me to save me from worse fate. You gave me work instead of chains. You make sure your people are fed and protected. That doesn't erase—" "No, it doesn't erase the past, but it shows who you choose to be now." Magnus stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and cupped her face in his hands. "You see too much good in me," he whispered. "Maybe you don't see enough." And then he was kissing her, desperate and hungry, as if she were air and he had been drowning. Alara melted against him, her hands fisting in his shirt, all thoughts of propriety forgotten. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "This is madness," Magnus said, resting his forehead against hers. "Yes," Alara agreed. "If anyone finds out, I know. You could be hurt. I could be seen as weak. I understand the risks." Magnus pulled back to look at her. "And yet you're still here." "I'm still here." He kissed her again, softer this time, filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "What have you done to me?" he murmured against her lips. Their secret meetings became a dangerous addiction. Magnus would find excuses to visit the library, or summon Alara to his study for tasks that could have been done by any servant. They stole moments together like thieves in the night, always careful, always watching for prying eyes. But in a castle full of people, secrets were hard to keep. Captain Roland, Magnus's second-in-command, had served under the warlord for 10 years. He was loyal, competent and ambitious in the way that made him dangerous. He also noticed everything. "You seem Distracted lately, my lord, Roland commented one morning as they reviewed reports from their border scouts. Do I? Magnus didn't look up from the maps spread across his desk. The men have noticed it too. You're softer in your commands, more lenient with mistakes. Now Magnus did look up, his eyes sharp. Are you questioning my leadership, Captain? Never, my lord. I'm merely concerned. Your enemies see weakness as opportunity. Magnus set down his quill carefully. And what weaknesses do my enemies see? Roland smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Perhaps they wonder why the great Magnus the Ruthless spends so much time in the library these days, or why a certain slave girl has access to areas of the castle usually reserved for nobles. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Choose your next words very carefully, Captain, Magnus said quietly. I mean no offense, my lord. I'm simply pointing out that appearances matter. Your reputation is built on being untouchable, unmovable. If people begin to think you can be influenced, it could be problematic. Magnus stood slowly, his hand moving to rest on the pommel of his sword. Are you threatening her? I'm protecting you, my lord, as I always have. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Finally, Magnus spoke. Thank you for your counsel, Captain. You're dismissed. Roland bowed and left, but his parting smile promised that this conversation was far from over. That night, Magnus found Elara in the library, reorganizing a shelf of philosophy texts. She looked up when he entered, her face lighting up with a smile that made his chest tight. You look troubled, she observed, setting down the book she was holding. Magnus closed the door behind him and moved to where she stood. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. We need to be more careful, he murmured into her hair. What's happened? Roland suspects, and if he knows, others will soon know too, Elara finished. Magnus pulled back to look at her. I could send you away, give you gold and a horse, set you free. You could start a new life somewhere safe. The offer should have filled her with joy. Freedom was all she had wanted since the day she was sold, but the thought of leaving Magnus, of never seeing him again, felt like a knife to the heart. Is that what you want? She asked. What I want and what's best for you are two different things. Let me decide what's best for me. Magnus cupped her face in his hands. Elara, if you stay, if we continue this, there will come a time when I have to choose between you and my position. Between love and power. And what will you choose? Magnus closed his eyes. I don't know, and that terrifies me more than any army I've ever faced. 2 days later, a messenger arrived with news that would test Magnus's resolve in ways he never imagined. Lord Aldrich the Bold, ruler of the southern kingdoms, was marching north with an army of 10,000 men. His message was simple: surrender your lands and kneel, or be destroyed. Magnus called his war council immediately. The great hall filled with his captains and advisors, their faces grim as they studied the reports. His army is twice the size of ours, Captain Roland pointed out. And they're fresh, while our men have been fighting border skirmishes for months. Then we'll make our stand at Raven's Pass, Magnus decided. The narrow gorge will neutralize their numbers advantage. And if we lose? Asked Sir Garrett, an older knight with grey in his beard. We won't lose, Magnus said with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. As the meeting broke up and the men began to file out, Captain Roland lingered behind. A word, my lord, Magnus nodded curtly. This battle will require all your focus, Roland said. Any distractions could prove fatal. Speak plainly, Captain. The girl, my lord. She should be secured before we march. Locked away where she can't interfere with your judgment. Magnus's hand moved to his sword. You forget yourself. Do I? My lord, I've served you faithfully for 10 years. I've never seen you hesitate in battle, never seen you show mercy to an enemy. But lately, Roland shook his head. Love has made weak men of stronger warriors than you. Before Magnus could respond, the door to the hall burst open. A young soldier ran in, his face pale with fear. My lord, come quickly. There's been an incident. Magnus's blood turned to ice. What kind of incident? The slave girl, my lord. She's been hurt. Magnus ran through the corridors faster than he had ever moved, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found a crowd gathered outside the library, servants and guards murmuring among themselves. Ilara sat on the floor, her back against the wall, holding a cloth to her bleeding forehead. Martha knelt beside her, checking her injuries. What happened? Magnus demanded, dropping to his knees beside them. Someone pushed me down the stairs, Ilara said weakly. I didn't see who. Magnus's hands shook as he gently examined the cut on her forehead. It wasn't deep, but it was bleeding freely. Get the healer, he commanded. Now. As Martha hurried away, Magnus helped Ilara to her feet. She swayed slightly, and he caught her against his chest. I'm all right, she whispered. No, you're not. Magnus's voice was rough with emotion. Someone hurt you. Someone in my own castle. Over Ilara's head, he caught Captain Roland, watching from the edge of the crowd. The man's expression was carefully neutral, but something in his eyes made Magnus's suspicions crystallize into certainty. That night, after the healer had tended to Ilara's wounds and declared her free of serious injury, Magnus confronted his captain in private. It was you, he said without preamble. Roland didn't bother to deny it. She fell down some stairs. Accidents happen. You could have killed her, but I didn't. Consider it a gentle warning, my lord. Next time, I might not be so restrained. Magnus drew his sword in one fluid motion, the blade stopping at Roland's throat. There won't be a next time, he said softly. Roland smiled. Kill me, and you'll have to explain to your men why you murdered your most loyal captain over a slave girl. How will that look? How will it affect morale before the biggest battle of your career? Magnus pressed the blade closer. A thin line of blood appeared on Roland's neck. You think I won't do it? I think you're smarter than that. You need me, my lord. You need my tactical mind, my experience, my loyalty. Loyalty? You just threatened the woman I love. And there it is, Roland said triumphantly. The weakness that will destroy you. You've just admitted that you value a slave girl over your duty to your men, your lands, your legacy. Magnus stared at his captain for a long moment, the sword trembling in his grip. Then, slowly, he lowered the blade. You're right, he said quietly. I do need you, for now. Roland straightened his tunic, still smiling. You've made the wise choice, my lord. But know this, Magnus continued, his voice deadly calm. If you touch her again, if you even look at her wrong, I will kill you, slowly, and I'll make sure your death serves as an example to anyone else who might threaten her. The smile faded from Roland's face. Do we understand each other, Captain? Perfectly, my lord. The army began preparations to march to Raven's Pass. Magnus threw himself into the planning with desperate energy, trying to push aside thoughts of what would happen if he didn't return. But late at night, when the castle grew quiet, he found himself drawn to Ilara's room like a moth to flame. She was sitting by the window, reading by candlelight. The bandage on her forehead was stark white against her dark hair. You should be resting, he said softly. She looked up, her face lighting up at the sight of him. I couldn't sleep. I keep thinking about the battle. Magnus closed the door behind him and moved to sit beside her on the narrow bed. Don't think about it, he said, pulling her against his side. Think about after, when I come back. What if you don't? The question hung between them like a blade. I will, Magnus said with more confidence than he felt. Promise me.
Elara?
Promise me you'll come back. Promise me you won't do anything foolishly heroic to prove you're still ruthless. Magnus turned to face her fully. What do you mean? I mean, Roland isn't the only one who's noticed changes in you. The servants talk. They say you're different, kinder, and they're right. She cupped his face in her hands. But I'm afraid you'll try to prove them wrong by taking unnecessary risks in battle. You think I'd get myself killed to maintain my reputation? I think you're torn between the man you were and the man you could be, and that kind of internal war can be more dangerous than any external enemy. Magnus leaned into her touch. You know me too well. I know you're good. I know you're brave, and I know you're worth coming home to. He kissed her then, pouring all his love and fear and desperation into the contact. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. If I don't make it back, he began. If I don't make it back, he continued firmly. Martha has instructions. You'll be given gold and safe passage to anywhere you want to go. You'll be free. Tears began to fall down Elara's cheeks. I don't want to be free if it means losing you, and I don't want to die knowing you'll never have the chance to live the life you deserve. They held each other through the night, neither speaking of the battle to come, both knowing it might be their last night together. The army departed at dawn, banners flying in the morning breeze. From her window in the east tower, Elara watched until the last soldier disappeared over the hill. For 3 days the castle waited. Servants went about their duties with unusual quiet. The very stones seemed to hold their breath. On the 4th day, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. Elara ran to the battlements with the rest of the castle's inhabitants, her heart hammering with hope and fear. The rider was one of Magnus's men, his armor dented and blood-stained. He collapsed from his horse in the courtyard, barely able to speak. The battle, he gasped. We won, but the cost. Where is Lord Magnus? Martha demanded. The soldier looked up with haunted eyes. Captured, Lord Aldrich. He has... The world seemed to tilt beneath Elara's feet. Captured, not dead, but perhaps worse. That night a second messenger arrived. This one bore Lord Aldrich's seal and a message that made Elara's blood run cold. Lord Aldrich was willing to negotiate Magnus's release. But he had conditions. He wanted the northern territories to submit to his rule. He wanted Magnus's castle and all its treasures, and he wanted something else. He wanted the slave girl he'd heard so much about, the one who had turned the ruthless warlord soft. He knows about you, Martha whispered, as they read the message together. Someone told him. Elara didn't need to guess who. Roland had survived the battle and somehow made contact with Aldrich. What will you do, child? Elara stared at the parchment, her mind racing. Magnus was being held prisoner because of her, because his love for her had been seen as weakness by his enemies. I'll go to him, she said quietly. Elara, no. Lord Aldrich is known for his cruelty. If you surrender yourself, Magnus would die before he let harm come to me. But if I don't go, he'll die anyway, and his people will suffer under Aldrich's rule. Martha's eyes filled with tears. There has to be another way. There is no other way. This is the price of love. That night, Elara wrote a letter to Magnus. She told him everything she felt, everything she hadn't had the chance to say. She sealed it with wax and gave it to Martha. Make sure he gets this. When he's free. When you're both free, Martha corrected firmly. Elara smiled sadly. Perhaps. The next morning she rode out to meet Lord Aldrich's army, alone except for a small escort of Magnus's most trusted men. They had orders to return to the castle once the exchange was made. Lord Aldrich's camp was vast, filled with soldiers and siege engines. At its center sat a great pavilion bearing the golden lion banner of the southern kingdoms. Inside the pavilion, Lord Aldrich waited. He was a man in his 50s, handsome in a cold way, with calculating eyes and a cruel mouth. "So," he said, as Elara was brought before him, "you're the famous slave girl, the one who tamed Magnus the Ruthless." "I am Elara of Millhaven," she said, lifting her chin, "and I've come to negotiate my lord's release." Aldrich laughed. "Negotiate? You're in no position to negotiate, girl. You're here to submit. Then let me see that he's alive and unharmed." Aldrich gestured to his guards, who pulled back a curtain at the rear of the pavilion. Magnus was chained to a post, his shirt torn and blood-stained, but his eyes were alert and furious, and when he saw Elara, they filled with horror. "No," he said hoarsely. "Elara, no, go back. Don't do this." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "How touching," Aldrich sneered. "The great warlord, brought low by love. It's almost poetic." He stood and moved to where Magnus was chained. "Did you really think you could change? Did you believe that playing at being a better man would make you one?" "Let her go," Magnus growled. "Your quarrel is with me." "Oh, but she's the key to everything, isn't she? She's your weakness, your breaking point." Aldrich smiled cruelly. "Tell me, Magnus, what would you do to keep her safe?" Magnus's jaw clenched. "Anything. Even kneel? Even renounce your claim to the northern territories?" The pavilion fell silent except for the sound of Magnus's labored breathing. "Yes," he said finally. Aldrich's smile widened. "Then kneel." What happened next would be spoken of in hushed whispers for generations to come. As Magnus sank to his knees before his captor, something broke in Elara's chest. Not her heart that had been breaking since she first saw him chained and bloody. Something deeper. Something that had been building since the night he bought her, since their first kiss, since she realized she loved a man who was slowly destroying himself with guilt and self-hatred. "Stop," she said. The word cut through the pavilion like a blade. Both men turned to look at her. Magnus with desperation in his eyes, Aldrich with amusement. "Stop," she repeated, stepping forward. "You want him to kneel? You want to break the great Magnus the Ruthless? You're going about it all wrong." Aldrich raised an eyebrow. "Am I? You think his love for me makes him weak, but you're wrong. It makes him stronger. It gives him something worth fighting for beyond pride and power." She moved to stand between Magnus and Aldrich, her heart hammering but her voice steady. "You want to see him broken? Then kill me, because watching me die will destroy him in ways that no amount of chains or humiliation ever could." "Elara, stop," Magnus said urgently. But she pressed on. "But if you truly want to defeat him, if you want to crush his spirit completely, then you need to understand what he fears most." "And what's that?" Aldrich asked, leaning forward with interest. "He fears becoming his father. He fears that all the good he's tried to do, all the ways he's tried to change, mean nothing in the face of his past sins." Elara turned to look at Magnus, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He thinks he doesn't deserve love. He thinks he doesn't deserve redemption. He thinks he's irredeemably lost." Magnus stared at her, something shifting in his expression. "But he's wrong," Elara continued, her voice growing stronger. "Love didn't make him weak. It made him brave enough to try to be better. It made him strong enough to admit his mistakes. It made him human." She turned back to Aldrich. "So if you want to break him, you'll have to break the part of him that's learned to hope, the part that believes in second chances, the part that dares to love." For a moment, the pavilion was silent except for the distant sounds of the camp. Then Aldrich began to laugh. "Clever girl. Very clever. You're trying to manipulate me into sparing you both." "No," Elara said quietly. "I'm trying to show you that you've already lost." "Have I?" "Yes. Because even if you kill us both, even if you take his lands and destroy his legacy, you can't undo what he's become. You can't take away the fact that he chose love over fear, that he chose to be better than what the world expected him to be." Aldrich's smile faded. "Pretty words. But they won't save you. They don't have to. The truth doesn't need saving." And then something extraordinary happened. Magnus, still on his knees, began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle, growing stronger until it filled the pavilion. Both Elara and Aldrich stared at him in shock. "She's right," he said, looking up at his captor with eyes that no longer held desperation, but something that looked almost like pity. "You have lost. I have an army. I have you in chains. How have I lost?" Magnus struggled to his feet, the chains clanking with the movement. "Because for 20 years I've been afraid. Afraid of being weak, afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of letting anyone close enough to hurt me. And that fear made me exactly what you are now. A man who thinks power is more important than love, who believes cruelty is strength." He looked at Elara, and his expression softened. "But she taught me something. She taught me that real strength isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing love despite the fear. It's choosing to be vulnerable despite the risk." Magnus turned back to Aldrich, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who had found his true power. "So yes, you can kill us. You can take my lands, destroy my castle, scatter my people. But you can't take away what I've learned. You can't undo the fact that I chose to be better than what you are." Aldrich's face darkened with rage. Guards seized the girl. But before the guards could move, a commotion erupted outside the pavilion. Shouts, the clash of steel, the thunder of horses. The tent flap burst open, and Sir Garrett charged in with a dozen of Magnus's knights behind him. "My lord," Garrett called, his sword already cutting through Magnus's chains, "we've scattered their outer guard." In the chaos that followed, Elara found herself pulled against Magnus's chest as he shielded her from the fighting. Around them, steel rang against steel as his knights battled Aldrich's guards. "How?" she gasped. "Martha," Magnus said, his arms tight around her. She rallied the men, told them their lord was worth fighting for, even without orders. When the dust settled, Aldrich lay dead, struck down by Sir Garrett's blade. His army, leaderless and caught off guard, began to scatter. But Magnus had eyes only for the woman in his arms. "You magnificent, foolish, brave woman," he murmured, cupping her face in his hands. "You saved me. We saved each other," Elara corrected. And as Magnus kissed her there in the ruined pavilion, surrounded by the aftermath of battle, Elara felt something she had never experienced before. She felt free. 3 months later, the great hall of Magnus's castle was transformed. Banners hung from the rafters, not of war but of celebration. The tables groaned under the weight of food and wine, and the air rang with laughter and music. It was a wedding day. Magnus stood at the altar in his finest clothes, his dark hair shining and his face clean-shaven, except for a neat beard. The scar on his cheek had faded to a thin silver line that only enhanced his rugged handsomeness, but his eyes were fixed on the doorway, waiting. When Elara appeared, a collective gasp went up from the assembled guests. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes, and her dark hair was crowned with flowers. But it wasn't her beauty that made the crowd stare. It was the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, the unmistakable bearing of a woman who had found her place in the world. As she walked down the aisle, Alara's eyes never left Magnus's face. She saw the love there, the wonder, the promise of all the days to come. When she reached the altar, Magnus took her hands in his. "You're sure?" he asked, quietly, for her ears alone. "I've never been more sure of anything," she replied. The ceremony was simple, but moving. They spoke vows they had written themselves, promises of love and loyalty, of supporting each other through whatever storms might come. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Magnus kissed his bride with a tenderness that brought tears to many eyes. "My lady," he murmured against her lips. "My lord," she replied, then smiled. "My love." The celebration lasted long into the night. Magnus's knights toasted their lord's happiness, the servants danced with joy, and even the most hardened warriors wiped away tears as they watched their fearsome leader transformed by love. Late in the evening, as the festivities continued below, Magnus and Alara slipped away to the battlements where they had once stood as master and slave. Now they stood as equals, as partners, as two halves of one whole. "Do you ever regret it?" Magnus asked, pulling Alara close against the cool night air. "Choosing this life? Choosing me?" Alara looked up at the stars scattered across the velvet sky, then back at her husband's face. "How could I regret finding my home?" she asked. Magnus's arms tightened around her. "I love you, Alara. With everything I am, everything I've been, everything I hope to become. And I love you, Magnus, not despite your past, but because of how you've chosen to rise above it." They stood together in comfortable silence, looking out over the lands that were now theirs to protect and nurture. In the distance they could see the lights of the village that had grown up around the castle, filled with people who no longer feared their lord, but trusted him. "What do you think the future holds?" Alara asked. Magnus considered the question seriously. "I think it holds whatever we choose to make of it. Adventures, challenges, probably a few more battles. And," he smiled, the expression transforming his face from handsome to beautiful, "and children, lots of children. Little girls with your courage, and little boys with your stubborn streak." Alara laughed. "My stubborn streak? Who else would have been foolish enough to fall in love with Magnus the Ruthless? The same woman who was wise enough to see through to Magnus the Good." As if summoned by their words, Martha appeared on the battlements, her face glowing with happiness. "My lord, my lady," she said, "forgive the interruption, but the guests are asking for you. They want to raise one final toast." Magnus and Alara exchanged a look. "Shall we?" he asked, offering her his arm. "Always," she replied, taking it. As they walked back toward the warmth and light of the great hall, toward their friends and family and the life they had built together, Alara reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She had been sold as a slave, bought for 20 silver coins by a man the world called Ruthless, but love had transformed them both, her from victim to victor, him from conqueror to protector. And in that transformation, they had found something more precious than all the gold in the kingdom. They had found each other. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the castle corridors as 2 small forms raced through the halls, their nurse chasing after them with fond exasperation. "Lord Marcus, Lady Isabel, come back here this instant." But the twins, aged 4 and possessed of their parents' stubborn independence, were having none of it. They burst into the great hall where their father was meeting with his advisors, their faces flushed with mischief. "Papa!" Isabel launched herself at Magnus, who caught her with practiced ease. "We escaped," Marcus announced proudly, climbing onto his father's lap despite the protests of the visiting dignitaries. Magnus looked around the table at his advisors, men who had once feared to breathe too loudly in his presence, and saw nothing but indulgent smiles. "Gentlemen," he said solemnly, "I believe we've been invaded by very small but determined enemies." Sir Garrett, now greying but still sharp, chuckled. "Perhaps we should negotiate terms, my lord." "What are your demands?" Magnus asked his children seriously. "Story time," Isabel declared. "With Mama," Marcus added. Well, in that case, I surrender unconditionally." As if summoned by her children's voices, Elara appeared in the doorway of the great hall. Even after 5 years of marriage and 2 children, Magnus still felt his breath catch at the sight of her. She wore a simple green dress that complemented her dark hair, now streaked with premature silver that only made her more beautiful. Her hands rested on the gentle swell of her belly, where their 3rd child grew. "I see our little negotiators have been successful," she said, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Completely," Magnus replied, standing with a child in each arm. "They've conquered the great hall and demanded story time. Well then, we'd better comply. After all, they are the future rulers of this domain." As they walked toward the family chambers, Marcus tugged on his father's sleeve. "Papa, tell us again about how you and Mama met." "You want to hear that old story again?" "It's not old," Isabel protested. "It's the best story." Magnus looked at his wife over their children's heads, and she smiled back at him with all the love that had grown and deepened over the years. "Very well," he said, "but this time your mother will have to help me tell it." "Once upon a time," Elara began, as they settled into the comfortable sitting room, the children curled between their parents. "There was a very fearsome warlord who thought his heart was made of stone." "But it wasn't," Marcus interjected, having heard the story dozens of times. "No, it wasn't," Magnus agreed, his arm tightening around his family. "It was just waiting for the right person to show him how to love." "And they lived happily ever after," Isabel finished triumphantly. "Yes," Elara said softly, her hand finding Magnus's and intertwining their fingers. "They did." Outside, snow began to fall on the castle and the thriving town beyond its walls. Inside, a family sat together in the warm glow of firelight, surrounded by the love that had transformed a ruthless warlord into a devoted husband and father. And in that moment, Magnus realized that he had finally found what he had been searching for all his life without knowing it. Not power, not fear, not even respect. Peace. The peace that came from being loved completely, flaws and all. The peace that came from loving in return with everything he had. The peace that came from building something beautiful and lasting with the woman who had seen his soul and chosen to stay. As his children's breathing grew slow and even, and his wife dozed against his shoulder, Magnus looked around at the life they had created together and smiled. He had once been Magnus the Ruthless, a man who took what he wanted and destroyed what stood in his way. Now he was simply Magnus, husband, father, protector of those he loved. And he had never been happier to leave his old self behind. For in the end, the greatest victory was not conquered lands or defeated enemies. The greatest victory was love. And love, Magnus had learned, was the one conquest that conquered the conqueror in return. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Ravenshire like tears that refused to fall. In the small stone cottage at the edge of the village, 22-year-old Mera Blackwood stood before a cracked mirror, trying to see what everyone else saw when they looked at her. Plain. That was the word they used. Always plain. Her brown hair hung limp around a face marked by exhaustion and worry. Her grey eyes, once bright with dreams, had grown dull from years of caring for her sick mother and managing their failing bakery. Her hands, rough from kneading dough and scrubbing floors, trembled as she touched her hollow cheeks. Too plain for marriage, the village women whispered. 22 and still unwed. What man would want such a girl? The truth cut deeper than any blade. While other girls her age had married and started families, Mira had remained trapped in a life that grew smaller each day. Her mother's illness had drained their savings. The bakery barely earned enough for medicine, and now the debt collectors were coming. A sharp knock echoed through the cottage. Mira's heart jumped as she recognized the sound. Heavy boots. Official business. The kind that brought only bad news. She opened the door to find Thomas Aldridge, the tax collector, standing with 2 guards. His cold blue eyes showed no mercy as he looked past her into the modest home. "Miss Blackwood," his voice was as sharp as winter wind, "your family owes the crown 50 gold pieces in back taxes. Payment is due today." 50 gold pieces. It might as well have been 50,000. Mira's stomach twisted into knots. "Please, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mother is dying. I need more time. The bakery will earn more once harvest season. Time is a luxury you can no longer afford." Thomas stepped closer, his shadow falling across her face. "However, there is another option." Mira's breath caught. "What option?" "A merchant has offered to pay your debt in exchange for a wife. You would be married before sunset, and your mother would receive the medicine she needs." Hope and horror warred in Mira's chest. "What merchant?" Thomas smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Magnus Thornfield. He's older. Had an accident with his leg some years back. Walks with a cane now, but he has gold. And gold is what you need." Mira had heard whispers about Magnus Thornfield, a reclusive man who lived in the old manor on the hill. Some said he was cursed. Others claimed he had made his fortune through dark magic. All agreed on one thing. He was strange, damaged and avoided by decent people. "I need to think." "There is no time to think." Thomas pulled out a rolled parchment. "Sign this contract or we seize the cottage and everything in it. Your mother will die in the streets." From the bedroom came a weak cough that made Mira's heart clench. Her mother, Eleanor, lay wasting away from the lung sickness that had slowly stolen her strength. Without medicine, she had perhaps days left. With it, she might see another spring. The choice was no choice at all. Mira's hand shook as she took the quill. The ink seemed to burn as she signed her name, sealing her fate with 3 simple strokes. She was no longer Mira Blackwood. In a few hours, she would become the wife of a stranger, a man everyone pitied or feared. "Good girl." Thomas rolled up the contract with satisfaction. "Magnus will collect you at sunset. Pack light. Your old life ends today." The hours passed like a fever dream. Mira helped her mother take the medicine that Thomas had brought with the contract, the first payment of her new husband's gold. Eleanor's breathing eased for the first time in months, and a bit of color returned to her pale cheeks. "My dear child," Eleanor whispered, taking Mira's hands in her own. "You have sacrificed everything for me." "You are my mother," Mira replied, fighting back tears. "I would do anything for you. But to marry a stranger, Magnus Thornfield has been alone for so long. People say he is bitter, angry at the world for his misfortune." Mira had heard the stories. Magnus had once been a young, ambitious trader who traveled the world buying and selling exotic goods. Then came the accident. His horse had spooked during a thunderstorm, throwing him from his cart onto sharp rocks. His leg was crushed, leaving him with a permanent limp and constant pain. Some said the injury had twisted more than his body. It had twisted his soul. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the sound of approaching wheels echoed through the village. Mira pressed her face to the window and saw a simple wooden cart pulled by an old brown horse. The driver was a tall man in a worn black coat, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. Magnus Thornfield had come for his bride. Mira gathered her few belongings: a change of clothes, her mother's Bible, and a small locket that had belonged to her grandmother. Everything she owned fit into a single cloth bag, her entire life reduced to something she could carry with one hand. The knock came soft but firm. Mira opened the door and found herself looking up at the man who was now her husband. Magnus Thornfield was not what she had expected. Yes, he was older, perhaps 40 years to her 22. His dark hair was streaked with early silver, and lines of pain creased the corners of his green eyes. He leaned heavily on a carved wooden cane, favoring his left leg. But he was not the monster the village gossips had painted. His face, while marked by suffering, held a quiet dignity. His clothes, though simple, were clean and well made, and when he looked at her, she saw not cruelty or anger, but something that surprised her: sadness. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice deep and careful, "I am Magnus Thornfield. I have come to honor our agreement." Mira nodded, unable to find words. The reality of what was happening crashed over her like a cold wave. She was leaving everything she had ever known to go with this stranger. She would share his home, his table, his bed. The thought made her cheeks burn with embarrassment and fear. "Your belongings?" Magnus asked gently. Mira held up her small bag. "This is everything." Something flickered in his eyes: surprise, perhaps pity. "I see. Well then, we should go." The journey to Thornfield Manor takes an hour, and the roads are not safe after dark. Mira kissed her mother goodbye, promising to visit as soon as she was able. Eleanor blessed her and whispered a prayer for happiness, though they both knew happiness was not part of this arrangement. This was about survival, nothing more. The cart ride was mostly silent. Magnus sat beside her on the driver's bench, managing the reins with practiced ease despite his injury. Occasionally he would glance at her, as if trying to solve a puzzle he did not understand. "Are you afraid?" he asked finally, as they climbed the winding road toward his manor. Mira considered lying, but something in his tone suggested he deserved honesty. "Yes." "Of me?" She looked at his profile in the dying light. The strong jaw, the patient way he handled the nervous horse, the careful consideration in his voice. "I don't know you well enough to be afraid of you. I'm afraid of everything else." Magnus nodded slowly. "That is fair. Fear of the unknown is natural. I will not lie to you, Miss Blackwood. Mira, I am not an easy man to live with. My injury has made me particular in my ways. I do not entertain guests or enjoy social gatherings. My world is small and quiet. Why did you want a wife?" The question escaped before Mira could stop it. Magnus was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Finally he said, "Loneliness is a slow poison. I thought perhaps companionship might be an antidote." The honesty in his words touched something in Mira's chest. This man, feared and avoided by the village, was simply lonely. Like her, he had been marked by others as unwanted. Perhaps they were more alike than she had imagined. Thornfield Manor appeared before them as the last light faded from the sky. It was not the dark, crumbling fortress Mira had pictured. Instead, it was a modest stone house surrounded by well-tended gardens. Light glowed warmly in the windows, and smoke rose from the chimney. It looked like a home. "It's beautiful," Mira said softly. Magnus seemed surprised by her words. "You think so? Most people find it gloomy. Most people haven't been living in a cottage with a leaking roof and doors that don't close properly. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first she had seen from him. "Well then, welcome to your new home, Mrs. Thornfield." Mrs. Thornfield. The name felt strange and foreign, like a coat that didn't quite fit. But as Magnus helped her down from the cart, his touch gentle despite his obvious pain, Mira began to wonder if perhaps this arranged marriage might be less terrible than she had feared. The interior of the manor was as surprising as the exterior. The rooms were tastefully furnished with comfortable chairs, thick rugs and shelves lined with books. Paintings of distant lands decorated the walls, scenes of bustling markets, snow-capped mountains, and ships sailing into sunset skies. "Your travels?" Mira asked, drawn to a painting of a desert oasis. "From my merchant days," Magnus confirmed. "Before my accident, I spent years exploring the world, buying and selling rare goods. These paintings remind me of better times." Mira heard the pain in his voice and understood. These images were not just art, they were memories of the man he used to be before fate changed everything. Mrs. Henley, the manor's housekeeper, appeared to greet them. A round, cheerful woman in her 50s, she had been caring for Magnus since his accident. Her eyes were kind as she welcomed Mira and showed her to her room. "Master Magnus is a good man," she whispered as they climbed the stairs. "Don't let the village gossips poison your mind against him. He's been hurt enough by this world." Mira's room was larger than her entire cottage had been. A fire crackled in the fireplace, and fresh flowers sat on the windowsill. The bed was soft with clean linens, and a wash basin with warm water waited for her use. It was more luxury than she had ever known. That night, Mira lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, she could hear Magnus moving about his room next door. The soft thump of his cane on the wooden floor marked his restless pacing. She wondered what kept him awake. Pain from his injury, regret over his hasty decision to marry a plain village girl, or something else entirely. The next morning, Mira woke to find breakfast waiting for her in the dining room. Magnus sat at the head of the table, reading from a thick ledger while he ate. He looked up as she entered, and she noticed the dark circles under his eyes. "Good morning," he said formally. "I trust you slept well?" "Yes, thank you." Mira took a seat across from him, still not sure what was expected of her in this strange new life. "Mrs. Henley has prepared quite a feast for your first morning," Magnus observed, gesturing to the table laden with fresh bread, eggs, bacon, and preserved fruits. It was indeed a feast compared to the thin porridge and mouldy bread that had been her usual fare. Mira's stomach rumbled loudly, betraying her hunger. She blushed with embarrassment. "Please eat," Magnus said gently. "You're far too thin. Mrs. Henley will take it as a personal insult if you don't sample everything." As Mira ate, she became aware that Magnus was watching her with a strange expression. Not the lusty hunger she had feared from a man who had bought himself a wife, but something more like concern. "The village did not treat you well," he said suddenly. It wasn't a question, and Mira felt heat rise in her cheeks. "What do you mean?" "You eat like someone who has been hungry for a long time. You flinch when I move too quickly, and your clothes." He gestured to her faded, patched dress. "They are well mended, but ancient. You have been struggling." Mira set down her fork, her appetite disappearing. "My mother's illness took everything we had. I did what I could, but it wasn't enough. And the villagers, did they help?" A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "The villagers pitied us. Poor Eleanor Blackwood, once the beauty of Ravenshire, wasting away from lung sickness, and her strange daughter too plain to marry, spending her youth caring for an invalid." Magnus leaned forward, his green eyes intense. "Strange? In what way?" "I read books instead of gossiping with the other girls. I preferred working in my garden to dancing at festivals. I asked too many questions and gave too many opinions. Mira met his gaze defiantly. I was not what a proper village girl should be. To her surprise, Magnus smiled. Good. Good? I have no use for a proper village girl. They bore me. He returned to his ledger, but she caught him glancing at her with something that might have been approval. The days that followed established a quiet routine. Magnus worked in his study, managing his business affairs and trading investments from afar. He received letters from merchants across the kingdom and sent replies with careful instructions. Despite his injury keeping him from traveling, his mind remained sharp for commerce. Mira explored the manor and its grounds. She discovered Magnus's library, filled with books on history, philosophy, mathematics, and trade. To her delight, he told her she was welcome to read anything she liked. "You enjoy books?" he asked one evening, finding her curled in a chair by the fireplace with a volume of poetry. "Very much. My father taught me to read before he died. He said knowledge was the one treasure no one could steal from you." Magnus settled into the chair across from her, wincing as he adjusted his injured leg. "Wise man, what are you reading?" Mira showed him the cover. "Sonnets by Lady Celia Worthington." "I've never read anything like them." "Ah, yes, Lady Celia. I met her once during my travels, a remarkable woman, brilliant, passionate, unafraid to speak her mind. Rather like you, I imagine." The comparison made Mira's heart flutter in a way she didn't understand. "You think I'm like her? You ask questions. You form your own opinions. You think for yourself." Magnus studied her face in the firelight. These are rare qualities, especially in someone so young. The village called them faults. The village is populated by small minds and smaller dreams. There was an edge to his voice that suggested old hurts. "I learned long ago that the opinion of fools is worth less than nothing." As the weeks passed, Mira began to see past Magnus's gruff exterior to the man beneath. Yes, he was often moody and sharp-tongued. His injury caused him constant pain, which made him irritable. He had little patience for inefficiency or stupidity. But she also saw his kindness. He sent money to her mother regularly, along with the finest medicines available. He noticed when Mira admired a particular flower in the garden and quietly arranged for more to be planted. He left interesting books where she would find them, knowing her tastes were expanding. Most tellingly, she saw his loneliness. In unguarded moments, she would catch him staring out the window with such profound sadness that it made her chest ache. He was a man who had lost his dreams and didn't know how to build new ones. One evening, as autumn painted the trees in brilliant colors, Mira found Magnus in his study staring at a painting of a distant marketplace. His expression was so lost that she couldn't help but approach. "You miss it," she said softly. "The traveling." Magnus didn't turn around. "Every day, I was meant to see the world, to experience everything it had to offer. Now I'm trapped in this body, in this house, watching life pass by through windows. But you're still trading, still connected to that world. Through letters and ledgers. It's not the same as walking through a spice market in Alexandria or watching the sun rise over the mountains of Tibet." He touched the painting with one finger. "I bought this in Cairo from an artist who had never left Egypt, yet somehow captured the soul of wanderlust." Mira studied the painting more closely. It showed merchants and travelers from many lands gathering in a busy square. The detail was extraordinary, each face telling its own story. But what struck her most was the sense of connection. People from different worlds coming together through trade and shared humanity. "It's beautiful," she said. "But Magnus, you brought the world to this house." These paintings, your books, the stories you could tell, the world is still with you. He turned to look at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. Is it? I've learnt more about distant places in these few weeks than in my entire life before. You've shown me cultures and customs I never knew existed. Through your eyes, through your memories. She gestured to the books and artifacts that filled his study. This isn't a prison, it's a treasure house. Magnus was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his whole face. When did you become so wise, Mira Thornfield? The sound of her married name on his lips sent warmth spreading through her chest. She was no longer the plain village girl who had been traded like livestock. She was Mrs. Thornfield, wife to a man who saw wisdom in her words and value in her thoughts. Perhaps wisdom comes from finally having someone who listens, she replied. That night marked a turning point in their relationship. Magnus began sharing more of his stories with her, describing the places he had seen and the people he had met. Mira found herself fascinated not just by the exotic locations, but by Magnus himself, his curiosity about other cultures, his respect for different ways of life, his generous spirit toward those less fortunate. She also began to see him as a man rather than just a stranger. She had married. When he laughed at something she said, her heart jumped. When he winced from pain, she wanted to comfort him. When he looked at her with approval, she felt beautiful for the first time in her life. But their marriage remained in name only. Magnus had never demanded his husbandly rights, and Mira was grateful but also confused. Did he find her so unappealing that he had no desire for her, or was there another reason for his restraint? The answer came on a cold November night, when a fierce storm battered the manor. Rain lashed the windows and wind howled through the eaves. Mira was reading by her bedroom fire when she heard a cry from Magnus's room. She rushed to his door and knocked. "Magnus, are you all right?" "Go away," came his muffled reply, but she could hear pain in his voice. Mira tried the handle and found the door unlocked. She pushed it open to find Magnus sitting on the edge of his bed, his face pale with agony. His injured leg was stretched out before him, the muscles cramped and twisted. "The cold makes it worse," he said through gritted teeth. "The old injury, sometimes it feels like it's happening all over again." Without thinking, Mira knelt beside him. "Let me help." "No." Magnus tried to pull away. "You shouldn't see me like this. I'm broken, Mira. Damaged goods." "You're my husband," she said firmly. "And you're in pain." She had learned something about healing from caring for her mother. Gently she began massaging the cramped muscles, working out the knots and easing the tension. Magnus resisted at first, embarrassed by his weakness, but gradually he relaxed under her touch. "Better?" she asked after several minutes. Magnus nodded, not trusting his voice. But when he looked at her, kneeling beside his bed with her hair loose around her shoulders and her grey eyes full of concern, something cracked open in his chest. "Why are you kind to me?" he whispered. "Because you deserve kindness. I bought you, like a piece of property." "What kind of man does that?" Mira considered her words carefully. "A lonely man who didn't know any other way to find companionship. A hurt man who had given up on being wanted for himself. And what kind of woman stays with such a man?" She smiled, and in the firelight Magnus thought she looked like an angel. A smart woman who recognizes that sometimes the best treasures come in unexpected packages. Magnus reached out and touched her face, tracing the line of her cheek with gentle fingers. "You're not plain," he said softly. "I don't know what fool convinced you that you were, but they were blind." Mira's breath caught. "Magnus, you have beautiful eyes, like storm clouds that promise rain after a drought. And when you smile, really smile, it lights up everything around you. I'm not beautiful like the village girls. The village girls are like pretty paintings, nice to look at, but with nothing beneath the surface. You, he cupped her face in both hands, you are like a rare gemstone. The beauty is hidden until someone takes the time to truly see. The space between them seemed to shrink. Mira felt her heart pounding as Magnus leaned closer. His eyes searched hers, asking a question she wasn't sure how to answer. "Mira," he breathed. "May I?" Instead of answering with words, she closed the distance between them. Their first kiss was soft, tentative, full of wonder. Magnus tasted like tea and possibility. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I never thought," Magnus began. "What?" "That I could want someone to want me back." Mira smiled and touched his lips with her fingertip. "I do want you, Magnus Thornfield, not your gold or your house or your name. You." That night, their marriage became real in every sense. Magnus was gentle and patient, treating Mira like precious china that might break if handled roughly. But she was stronger than he realized, and her passion surprised them both. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the warm darkness, Magnus traced patterns on Mira's bare shoulder. "I have a confession," he said quietly. "What's that?" "When Thomas Aldridge told me about your family's debt, I didn't just offer to pay it, I insisted on it." Mira propped herself up on her elbow to look at him. "What do you mean? I had seen you in the village before. Many times you were always hurrying somewhere, to the market, to the apothecary for your mother's medicine, to deliver bread from your bakery. You never noticed me, but I noticed you. Why didn't you speak to me?" Magnus laughed bitterly. "Look at me, Mira. I'm a crippled recluse with a reputation for being difficult. What could I possibly say to someone like you? Excuse me, miss, but would you like to come have tea with the local monster? So you arranged to buy me instead." Mira's tone was teasing rather than accusatory. "I told myself I was helping you, saving you from debt and poverty. But the truth is, I wanted you for myself. I had been watching you for months, admiring your strength, your devotion to your mother, the way you held your head high despite what people whispered about you." Mira was quiet for a moment, processing this revelation. "You loved me before you even knew me. I was fascinated by you. Love, that came after. When I saw how you looked at my books with hunger, how you asked thoughtful questions, how you saw beauty in things others overlooked." He pulled her closer. "When you called my house a treasure instead of a prison, and when did you know that you loved me?" Magnus considered. "The night you helped me with my leg, you could have been disgusted, frightened, repulsed. Instead, you knelt beside me and offered comfort. In that moment, I realized I had been given something I never expected. A partner, someone who would stand with me instead of looking down on me." "I was already falling in love with you by then," Mira admitted. "I just didn't recognize what it was. I had never been in love before. And now," she kissed him softly, "now I know that being plain was the best thing that ever happened to me. It meant no one else wanted me. So I was available when you came looking." "You're not plain," Magnus insisted. "You never were. You were overlooked, undervalued, hidden like a gemstone in rough stone. But I saw you. I saw your worth." As winter settled over Thornfield Manor, Mira and Magnus grew closer each day. They read together by the fire, discussed philosophy and trade, planned improvements to the house and gardens. Magnus began teaching her about his business, impressed by her quick mind for numbers and strategy. "You have natural instincts for commerce," he told her one day as she reviewed a contract proposal. You see the long-term implications others miss. I had to learn to think ahead, Mira replied. When you're poor, every decision has consequences. One wrong choice can mean the difference between eating and going hungry. Would you like to become more involved in the business? I could use a partner with your practical wisdom. Mira looked up from the papers, eyes shining. You would trust me with that? I would trust you with everything. And he did. As the months passed, Mira became not just Magnus's wife, but his true partner. She helped him expand his trading network, connecting with merchants who appreciated her direct, honest approach. Together, they developed new strategies for investment and growth. But more importantly, they healed each other's wounds. Magnus regained his confidence and sense of purpose. Mira blossomed under his admiration and respect, becoming the intelligent, capable woman she had always been meant to be. One spring evening, as they sat in the garden Magnus had expanded for her enjoyment, Mira made an announcement that would change everything once again. Magnus, she said, taking his hand, I have something to tell you. He looked up from the book he was reading, noting the excited nervousness in her voice. What is it? I'm with child. The book fell from Magnus's hands as his face transformed with wonder and joy. Truly, Mrs. Henley confirmed it today. We're going to have a baby. Magnus pulled her into his arms, spinning her around despite his injured leg. When he set her down, there were tears in his eyes. I never dared hope, he whispered. A family of my own. You're happy? Happy? Mira, you've given me everything I never knew I wanted. First your love, then your partnership, and now this. He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. A child who will grow up knowing they are wanted and treasured. The baby was born on a crisp October morning, after a labor that left Mira exhausted but triumphant. Magnus paced the floors below until Mrs. Henley called him up to meet his son. Little James Thornfield had his mother's grey eyes and his father's dark hair. He was perfect and healthy, and Magnus wept openly when he first held his son. Look at him. Magnus marveled. He's so small, so perfect. He has your hands, Mira observed from the bed. Long fingers. He'll be a merchant like his father, or a scholar like his mother. Did you know, Magnus said, settling beside her on the bed with their son still in his arms, that you're the most educated woman in 3 counties. You've read more books than most university graduates. Only because I married a man who encouraged learning instead of discouraging it. We're quite a pair, aren't we? Magnus smiled down at her, the crippled merchant and his plain wife. Don't you dare call me plain, Mira said with mock severity. I am Mrs. Magnus Thornfield, respected businesswoman, devoted mother, and beloved wife. I am many things, but plain is not one of them. Magnus leaned down and kissed her thoroughly. You're right. You are extraordinary, rare, precious beyond measure. You are my treasure, Mira Thornfield, more valuable than all the gold in the world. As their son grew, so did their happiness. James was a bright, curious child who inherited his parents' love of learning and their head for business. The family prospered, but more importantly, they thrived. The village eventually stopped whispering about the strange match between Magnus Thornfield and plain Mira Blackwood. Instead, they spoke with grudging respect about the couple who had built something beautiful from an arrangement that should have been merely practical. Magnus's leg never fully healed, and he never traveled the world again as he had in his youth. But he discovered something better than adventure in distant lands. He found home in the love of a woman who saw his worth when no one else would. And Mira, who had once believed herself too plain for love, learned that true beauty comes not from perfect features or fashionable clothes, but from being seen and valued by someone who matters. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they watched James play in the garden while his baby sister Emma toddled after him, Magnus took Mira's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Being traded to a crippled merchant for your family's debt?" Mira laughed, the sound like silver bells in the evening air. "Regret being rescued by the one man in the world who could see my true worth? Never. Even though I bought you like a piece of property. You didn't buy me, Magnus." She turned to face him, her eyes bright with love and wisdom. "You invested in me, and I have spent every day since proving you made the best bargain of your merchant career." Magnus pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, still amazed after all these years that this incredible woman was his. "Indeed I did," he murmured against her ear. "Indeed I did." In the village, people still told the story of Magnus Thornfield and his wife. But it was no longer a tale of pity or strangeness. It had become something else entirely, a story of hidden treasures, unexpected love, and the magic that happens when two overlooked souls find each other in a world that had failed to see their worth. And if sometimes young women who felt plain or unwanted would look up at Thornfield Manor and dream of their own merchant who might see their true value, well, that was magic too. For in the end, the greatest treasures are often disguised as ordinary things, waiting for someone wise enough to recognize their worth. Magnus Thornfield had found his treasure in a girl the world called plain, and she had found hers in a man the world called broken. Together they proved that love has its own economy, where the heart's true currency is not gold, but the courage to see beauty where others see only flaws. The old saying was wrong. They learned. All that glitters is not gold, but sometimes the things that don't glitter at all are the most precious treasures of all. The end.